Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have faced the possibility of being the next target. It was precisely this fear that led the three countries to join NATO in 2004, and today, more than 20 years later, it is once again shaping their strategy. Among them, Lithuania has taken the lead with a bold plan to build a 48-kilometer-deep defensive belt along its entire border with Kaliningrad and Belarus. The measure is not symbolic. Vilnius, the country's capital, is only 34 kilometers from the Belarusian border, a target too vulnerable to be ignored. Inspired by modern defense like the Surovikin Line and steering clear of the failures of the Maginot Line, this layered system was designed to delay, channel, and weaken any invasion, buying time for NATO to react. It is an attempt to turn geographical fragility into strategic deterrence and to send Moscow a clear message. If aggression comes, the cost will be extremely high. The Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, have always lived with the fear that Russia would, at some point, turn its eyes to the region. Decades of think tank analyses and warnings from Western leaders pointed to this possibility. It was no accident that in March 2004, these three countries rushed to join NATO. The memory of Soviet domination was still fresh, and Moscow's presence remained a constant threat. This fear increased dramatically in 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The brutality of that conflict served as a reminder that Moscow's plans were not limited to Ukraine alone. For the Baltic countries, which gave unconditional support to Kiev, the message was clear. If Russia succeeded there, they could be next. The threat was no longer theoretical, but a real and imminent possibility. Faced with this scenario, the response of the Baltic states was to prepare as never before. In conjunction with NATO, measures began to be implemented to make an invasion not just difficult, but extremely costly for Moscow. The most concrete of these initiatives came from Lithuania. The government announced the construction of a 30-mile deep defensive belt along its borders with Russia and Belarus. It is an elaborate system designed to delay and wear down any invasion, creating a true modern wall against aggression. This decision marks a turning. For the first time, the threat of a Russian attack is being met with a large-scale defense structure, inspired by the most recent lessons from the Ukrainian battle. And its impact is not limited to Lithuania. It is a clear message that the Baltic countries do not intend to be caught off guard. But to understand why these defenses are so urgent, one must look more closely at the region's geography, which in itself represents an enormous challenge. The geography of the Baltic countries has always been a factor that makes them vulnerable in any military confrontation with Russia. Unlike many NATO members, which have vast areas of territorial depth, the Baltics are on the front line, exposed and without natural barriers to hinder the advance of enemy. That is why, when we talk about the region's defense, it is not just a matter of political strategy, but an urgency dictated by the map itself. Estonia, for example, shares a 322-kilometer direct border with Russia. This relatively short distance could be covered quickly by armored vehicles and mechanized troops in a war scenario. Latvia is in an even more delicate situation. In addition to a 295-kilometer border with Russia, it has another 171 kilometers with Belarus, further increasing the risk of being attacked on two different fronts. But it is Lithuania that faces the greatest challenge. The country shares a 680-kilometer border with Belarus and another 274 kilometers with Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave in the heart of Europe, which is heavily militarized and considered one of the continent's greatest points of strategic tension. Kaliningrad, in particular, represents a constant threat. There, Moscow maintains troops, long-range artillery, and even missile systems capable of hitting targets throughout almost the entire Baltic region in a matter of minutes. This turns Lithuania into a surrounded country, pressured from the east by Belarus and from the west by Kaliningrad. For any NATO military planner, this is a logistical and strategic nightmare. And at the center of this chessboard is Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital. Located just 34 kilometers from the border with Belarus, the city could be threatened within hours in an open conflict. One only needs to travel the E28 highway to understand the gravity situation. There are no natural barriers, no major obstacles that could slow a Russian advance. This makes Vilnius an easy target, not only because of its physical proximity, but also due to the political symbolic importance of striking the administrative heart of Lithuania in the very first hours of an offensive. This reality places the Lithuanian government in a permanent dilemma: how to protect a capital so close to the front line. It is precisely here that the justification for the 30-mile deep defensive belt arises. It is not just an ambitious military engineering project, but a vital necessity. By creating successive layers of barriers, trenches, and fortifications, Lithuania seeks to ensure that any invasion attempt meets enough resistance to buy time to evacuate civilians, to mobilize local troops, and, most important, to allow for the rapid arrival of NATO reinforcement. In short, the geography of the Baltics does not forgive carelessness, and it is precisely this combination of extensive borders and the critical proximity of Vilnius that explains why the defensive plan is not just a precaution, but a requirement for national survival. This perception, however, rekindles historical memory. After all, it is not the first time a European nation has relied on large-scale fortifications to try to contain an imminent threat. The announcement of Lithuania's defensive belt was not met only with praise. In various military and academic circles, criticism emerged almost immediately. Many began to compare the project to a supposed 21st century Maginot Line, a reference loaded with historical symbolism, evoking both grandeur and failure. The Maginot Line was one of the most ambitious military undertakings in 20th century Europe. Built by France between 1929 and 1938, it was a colossal network of fortifications along the border with Germany. Its structure was impressive, several meters thick of reinforced concrete, reinforced steel, underground casemate connected by tunnels and galleries, ventilations, and even complete living quarters for thousands of soldiers. It was a fortress designed to withstand aerial bombardments, heavy artillery attacks, and even tankers. To many contemporaries, it seemed impenetrable. But history showed that even the most robust fortifications can be useless if they are not accompanied by strategic vision. In 1940, at the height of World War II, the Maginot Line was simply bypassed. The Germans, instead of directly attacking this colossal wall, chose to cross through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. This region was considered by the French to be impassable for large mechanized armies, but German armored divisions proved otherwise. Within a few weeks, the French army was in collapse, and the line, despite its imposing presence, had become irrelevant. It is precisely this lesson that Lithuania and its allies seek to avoid at all costs. They know that it is not enough to erect static barriers or rely solely on engineering. The Lithuanian plan calls for a defense-in-depth system that extends along the entire vulnerable border, leaving no gaps that could be exploited, as happened to France in 1940. The idea is not to allow the enemy to simply ignore the fortification, but to force them to confront them along their entire length. This historical comparison, though uncomfortable, helps to understand why the Baltic project is not limited to concrete and steel. It is conceived as a flexible system, with layers and redundancy inspired by recent war experience and not just by a distant past. And that is precisely where the main source of inspiration for the Baltics comes from: the war in Ukraine. The conflict revealed that in the 21st century, it is still possible to build defensive lines capable of paralyzing entire offensives, as long as they are designed for the modern reality of the battlefield. If there is a modern example that directly influenced Lithuania's plan, it comes from the war in Ukraine itself. It was there that the concept of defense in depth regained global prominence, proving that, even in the 21st century, fortified lines can still change the course of a conflict. In southeastern Ukraine, in 2023, Russia built what became known as the Surovikin Line, named after General Sergei Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon. The line was a vast defensive system designed to stop the expected Ukrainian counteroffensive, and its structure was impressive for its layered organization. The first layer consisted of extensive minefields and anti-tank ditches. These barriers not only slowed the enemy's advance, but also channeled vehicles into controlled corridors, where they were vulnerable to ambushes. The second layer was formed by so-called dragons, concrete blocks arranged in rows, designed to stop or at least hinder the movement of tanks and armored vehicles. These obstacles, often reinforced with barbed wire and metal barricades, created veritable artificial walls on the battlefield. Finally came the third layer, networks of interconnected trenches equipped with fighting machine guns, observation posts, and, in many cases, installed on high ground. This layout allowed not only for defensive resistance, but also for better use of Russian artillery, which could fire on Ukrainian columns trapped in the minefields or blocked by the dragon's teeth. The result was devastating for Kiev. When it launched its counter-offensive in 2023, Ukraine faced a solid defense that absorbed the initial impact and turned the advance into a slow, costly, and bloody process. The losses in men and equipment were substantial, and the expectation of a quick breakthrough in the Russian lines vanished. This experience did not go unnoticed by the Russians, the Ukrainians, or, least of all, the Baltic countries. Ukraine itself after facing the Surovikin Line, began to adopt similar measures, building its own layered defenses along more than 1,000 kilometers of the front line. Regions like Lyman, Avdiivka and Kupiansk gained complex fortifications precisely to avoid being surprised by enemy offensive. For Lithuania, the message is clear. It is not just about building walls or bunkers, but about creating an integrated defensive network with multiple layers and redundant. It is this concept, tested and proven on the Ukrainian battlefield, that directly inspires the Baltic defensive belt. And it is by looking at this recent example that Lithuania's plan reveals its ambition. But to understand the full scope of this strategy, one must observe how the project is being implemented in detail and how it connects to similar efforts in Estonia, Latvia, and even Poland. Lithuania's plan is not just an abstract idea on paper, but a concrete project that has already begun to be put into practice. It is a 30-mile defensive belt, equivalent to about 48 kilometers in depth, which will extend along the entire border with Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. It is the most robust and ambitious initiative announced so far by a Baltic country. This project will be implemented in 2 phases. The first, with a deadline of 2028, focuses on erecting the fundamental structures that can effectively stop or at least delay a Russian advance. It is the immediate preparation which seeks to turn the territory into a veritable hostile labyrinth for any invading force. The second phase, planned from 2029 onwards, will focus on the maintenance, modernization and evolution of the system, ensuring that it does not become obsolete over the years. Like the Surovikin Line, the Lithuanian defense will also be organized in layers. Right at the front line, anti-tank ditches will hinder the advance of armored vehicles. Behind them, Dragon's Teeth, concrete barriers designed to block heavy vehicles, come into play. Next, extensive minefields increase the risk and limit the mobility of enemy troops. And to complete it, 2 layers of infantry positions will be strategically distributed, prepared to resist and counterattack. To make this network viable, Lithuania is already establishing 27 engineering equipment parks. In them, crucial materials such as barbed wire, concrete blocks, and so-called metal hedgehog, star-shaped structures that serve to stop vehicles, are stored. These depots allow reinforcements to be quickly mobilized and additional barriers to be erected at critical points with agility. But the effort is not isolated. In January 2024, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia signed an agreement for the creation of a common Baltic Defense Line. The idea is if one country is attacked, the defensive network of the others complements the resistance, creating a regional wall against any invasion. Estonia and Latvia have already begun to put their plans into practice. Estonia announced the construction of 600 bunkers. A 65 million investment will serve as fortified resistance. Latvia, for its part, began in May 2024 to install similar barriers, creating concrete obstacles and metal structures at strategic points along the border. And the movement is not restricted to the Baltic country. In May 2024, Poland announced the so-called East Shield, a monumental $2.5 billion project to fortify its nearly 700-kilometer border with Belarus and Kaliningrad. The entire system is expected to be ready by 2028, functioning as another layer of containment against any attempt at Russian aggression. The logic behind all these initiatives is the same. It is not about erecting impenetrable barriers, but about creating a system capable of delaying the enemy, channeling their forces to unfavorable points, and, above all, buying time. Time that will be vital for NATO reinforcements to arrive and turn the tide in favor of the defender. This joint effort shows that the countries of the region have understood the gravity of the threat and are willing to invest heavily in their own security. But even with increasingly sophisticated defensive lines, there is still a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed: the shortage of military manpower given the size of the Russian and Belarusian forces. This is precisely the challenge that brings us to the next point. Despite all the effort in building increasingly sophisticated defensive lines, the Baltic countries face an obstacle that no fortification can solve alone: a lack of military personnel. This is the most delicate point of the entire strategy. Lithuania, which is leading the defensive belt, has about 23,000 active soldiers and 104,000 reservists. Estonia, in turn, has just over 7,500 active military personnel and 41,000 in reserve. Latvia has approximately 8,500 active soldiers and 16,000 reservists. These numbers, when placed side by side with those of their hostile neighbors, reveal the disparity. Belarus alone has around 65,000 military personnel in service and another 350,000 reservists. Russia, for its part, can mobilize much larger with millions of soldiers and an incomparably more extensive equipment base. It is in this scenario of imbalance that the crucial role of NATO comes into play. As formidable as the defensive belt may be, it only fulfills its function if there are rapid and sufficient reinforcements to sustain the resistance. The strategy is clear. Buy time. Time for the alliance's troops to mobilize and reinforce the front before the enemy a lightning victory. There are already concrete signs of this commitment. United States troops are present in the region, but the biggest reinforcement will come from Germany. By 2027, an entire brigade of 5,000 German soldiers will be permanently deployed to Lithuania. This presence, combined with the battalions already in operation from other allied countries, ensures that, in the event of an invasion, the response will not depend only on local forces, but on the entire collective power of NATO. If the predictions of analysts and military leaders are correct, a possible Russian offensive could happen between 2029 and 2030. And when that moment comes, Lithuania and its neighbors intend to be ready. The defensive belt, combined with international support, aims not only to delay the enemy's advance, but to make the cost of an invasion so high that in practice it discourages Moscow from trying. This is exactly what the Surovikin Line demonstrated in Ukraine. When a defense is deep, well-structured, and sustained, it can turn the battlefield into an almost insurmountable obstacle. In the end, the Baltic bet is that preparation will be enough to avoid confrontation. The real victory will be if these defenses never need to be tested in combat. And that is why following these developments is so important. After all, what is happening in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland could define the future of European security in the coming years. If you like this video and want to continue receiving detailed analyses on topics like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and leave a like.